Okay, good afternoon. Let's go ahead and get started. We may have some people coming in late, but that's all right. A couple of housekeeping things. First of all, yes, lunch order, very important. In fact, I was talking to somebody a little bit earlier this afternoon. Sounds like a silly thing, lunch, but it's actually very important during the bar exam. You want to eat the right thing, number one, because if you eat too much or too little, then you're shot for the afternoon. So we give you lunch, and we have a lunch menu that is chosen to be good brain food and to be good bar exam food. Yes, sir?
Can we pay so you can bring us some Red Bulls? No, I'm serious. I don't think you could have access to that.
I personally would not pay to give you some Red Bull because that's dangerous in the bar exam, okay? Here's what, I'm going to give you a few little comments on food, which is from years and years and years of experience. You don't want a lot of caffeine. You do not want a lot of caffeine. Now, that means if you are used to existing on Red Bulls, and there are some of you out there who probably are, don't overdo it during the study period. You got to learn how to pace yourself. You do not want to have highs and lows in the exam. And in the morning, it's particularly important, especially for those of you who are coffee drinkers. If you caffeine up in the morning, you're going to crash before the morning session is done, and you can't get caffeine during the exam. So beware of that. Learn how to function without overdoing caffeine. Same thing with sugar. If you're used to putting a lot of sugar in your coffee or having sugary breakfast foods, don't do it. And that's, again, why you have to be careful with your lunch as well. Learning how to eat for the bar exam is actually really important. It's an endurance exam. And before you go into that exam, particularly if you're a Red Bull fanatic, then practice taking the exam off the caffeine. I know, but because, hey, you know, and I'm a tea drinker, but tea has caffeine too. So believe me, I need my cup of tea in the morning. But you've got to understand that you can't step out in the middle of the exam and get a caffeine dose or a sugar dose or whatever dose. If there are any smokers out there, you already know the drill on that one. So the answer to your question is no, because it's bad for you. Okay, Amar, come on down. Any thoughts on if they want? We had a request for Red Bulls for Red Bull to be supplied at lunch, and I said no.
I'll tell you what. There are other schools that come in. I've come in the morning, and they come in. It's like going to Costco, and they come in with Red Bulls, and they're just feeding it. I personally don't think it's a good at all. I think if you're conditioning yourself to train your body, nah, it's okay, I don't care. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. I'm not going to throw Morgan under the table. I don't know. I mean, we can do it if you, but I don't think it's a good idea at all.
It's not.
Because the crash and burn after effect, it's a crutch. While you're studying, develop something else. Get gum. I'll buy you a whole bunch of gum if you want. Start chewing gum while you study. But the whole dependency on, it's a bigger problem than just kind of, oh, I'm studying for an exam.
Yeah, no,
I don't think it's a good thing.
It's a really bad idea.
Yeah. And we didn't talk. I don't know what she said.
Yeah. Well, so. And I'm glad. That's why I asked him to comment, because I'm very adamant about it. Yeah. But I got to tell you, you're going to crash and burn if you are existing on Red Bull. Not a good idea.
Yeah. That's fine.
Okay, so fill out your lunch form. The other thing about the lunch form, it's a convenience for you. Because we're going to have lunch for you right there in the convention center, so you don't have to go out. And there are places to eat in Tampa, but you don't want to have to go out of the building and deal with all of that, and you certainly don't want to drive any place. So take advantage of the lunch. Most people like the opportunity to just sort of sit and hang out with, and commiserate with your fellow students. If you're a person who doesn't want to talk to anybody, and there are some of you who might not, during the lunch break, get your lunch and then go sit outside and eat the lunch outside. It's like a box lunch. So take advantage of it. We need a lunch form because Mercedes will coordinate that because she's the one who actually goes there and sets up the lunch table. She needs to know who is wanting what. And a couple other just sort of basic things while I'm thinking about that. We, most of the time, well, we will have a table someplace. We just don't know exactly where in the convention center. They don't tell us until the last minute. But when we find out about it, you know, it'll have a sign, it'll say St. Thomas or something like that. You can, if you want to, leave things under the table. Now, I wouldn't leave anything that's particularly valuable, but remember, you can't take anything into the exam. So if there are some things that you don't worry too much about, you can place them under that table and retrieve them, because otherwise you really have no place to put them. Remember also, of course, as I said, you really can't take much of anything in. You can take earplugs if they're not connected to anything. You can no longer take watches, not even a watch like mine, which there's no way. This is just, you know, an old-fashioned kind of watch. You can't put any information in it. You can't even take these kinds of watches in anymore. They say, they told us, I mean, they have clocks up anyway, but they told us they'll have plenty of clocks. But understand that you can't take a watch in. And obviously you can't take your notes in, you can't take your phone in, and you be careful even how you dress. Now, you want to dress in layers. I can promise you that, whoever you are, because the room might be too cold. It would be too cold for me. It'd be too cold for most people. It might be too hot for a few people, but dress in layers. Remembering, though, with your layers, if you are somebody who is used to putting the hoodie up, and I'm going to tell you, if I were taking the exam, I would love to have a hood up, because you can screen out a lot, but you can't, because then they think you're beaming Scotty or something. I don't know. So you can't put the hood up, even if it's freezing, even if it helps you focus. The only thing you can do to help you focus is, of course, the earplugs. And you're subject, you know, to being searched, because people stick things in all sorts of strange places. It's the nature of the beast. Any kind of general questions about stuff like that so far that anybody has? We're going to, by the way, when we get to maybe the penultimate class or sometime around that time in February, we will be giving you earplugs, and we will have earplugs for you in Tampa as well.
For computer use, I just paid
Yeah.
that stupid fee.
Yeah.
I was just curious, I don't know, but when we're doing multiple choice, would that be like normal
Yes.
Scantron?
You're going to use Scantron. You do not do the multiple choice on the
You
computer.
just need it for a few hours, the computer.
You need it for your essays, right. Now, I want to make a couple of comments.
It's like painstaking.
Yeah, about the computers, and especially since we are starting to talk about essays today anyway. If you are used to taking your exams, first of all, on the computer, then you're going to pay the stupid fee, and you're going to take your computer, because if that's how you're used to being tested, you don't want to change it now. If you are someone who has handwritten all along, then don't switch all of a sudden at the last minute, because that's not going to be good for you. If you are using a computer, make sure you take a long enough cord. They give you instructions on the length of the cord, but you want to take an extended cord, because you're sitting at two top tables. The room is just full of two top tables, and they run down the aisles at certain points. They run power strips, but your normal laptop cord might not reach the power strip, and obviously if you run out of power, you're up a creek. So make sure that you do take a longer cord, and again, look at the site. They tell you the specifics on the cords. The other thing, just to make you aware, it's not to scare you, it's actually to get you to sort of get over the fear of it already. You probably have heard about the massive upload failure in July. Freaked a lot of people out, and I understand why. Because what happens is you finish the exam, you go back to your hotel room, and then you upload your exam. You do not upload at the convention center. You go back to your hotel room to upload. And people went back, and they tell you have to upload by, I think, 10 o'clock at night. Well, people tried to upload, and ExamSoft crashed. And people kept trying and trying and trying. You're back in your hotel room. There's nobody to communicate with. People were trying to communicate with the examiners. The examiners really couldn't get the information out, because they didn't have an email, distribution list. So it was problematic, and people were up till way past 10 o'clock, past midnight, trying to upload. And in the end, what people had to do is come back to the convention center the next morning and upload. Now, should some kind of technical event happen? First of all, if it happens during the exam, do be prepared to handwrite. So understand that, which means maybe you want to practice writing an essay or two longhand if you're not used to doing it, just so you know what to do. And you just have to, like a duck, you let the water roll off your back if it should happen to you. You should have a problem in the exam with your individual computer. Now, they swear up and down that there will be no problem with uploading this time. Should it happen, just roll with it. Don't get all freaked out. If you can't upload, you can't upload. What you don't want to do, and I know it happened to people, and you probably know people that it happened to. Yeah, we got plenty of pizza. This is pepperoni, that's cheese. It affected them when they got to the MBE portion on Wednesday because they were so freaked out from Tuesday. Believe me, I understand. I'd be kind of nervous too. You have to put it behind you and walk in on Wednesday and pretend like nothing bad happened. So once again, I don't think you're going to have those issues. Should you have an issue, just be as calm and as zen as you can about it. Other kinds of questions like that anybody has at this point? All right, so let's talk about the Florida portion of the exam before we jump into the essays. Yes, sir?
One more question. Do we leave our computers inside? Or do we take them out, and then if so, where do we put them?
Oh, it's a good question. You got to keep them with you. You don't. You don't need them for the afternoon. I'm going to have to find out what they want you to do there, because if you take them out, then you have no place to put them. So I think you have to leave them there. That is my guess. You do not need them for the afternoon, but there's nowhere else to put them. And the room is supposed to be secure. Your spot is your spot. So I wouldn't worry about that part of it, because the room is patrolled even when you're not in it. I will get an answer for you for the next class, but I believe that's what you do. Yes, sir?
The second day, you do not need it.
You do not need a computer. You cannot take a computer in the second day. The second day is the MB. The first day of the exam, let's sort of talk about that in case you're not entirely clear. First day, Tuesday, is the Florida day. You will have likely, I can't promise, but I'd say 99%, you'll have 3 essays in the morning. And then you'll have 3 multiple choice components in the afternoon. The reason I can't promise you is that there is no rule that absolutely requires that format. But it is what they've been doing for quite some time. So I don't think they're going to change that. Then Wednesday is the MBE, 100 questions in the morning, 100 questions in the afternoon. You're filling out Scantron. And again, for those of you who are using ExamSoft on the Tuesday afternoon when you're doing the Florida portion, you are using Scantron sheets. You are not entering the information onto your computer. Yes, ma'am. They have. They have storage, but I don't think they're full lockers. And I'm going to have to find out in terms of the computers what people do. No one's ever asked me that one before, which is interesting. As long as I've been doing this, no one's asked that question. I will get those details for you. The reason that I mentioned the table is because they don't have good storage. And a lot of people do just leave stuff under the table. I would not leave a laptop, obviously, under the table. But people who bring extra sweatshirts and stuff like that, and people who come with notes, which is kind of silly, but if they come with notes, they leave that under as well. I will get you detailed information on that, though. All right, so Tuesday, the Florida day, what happens? Again, in the morning, you are likely to have 3 essays. They used to do 4 essays and 2 multiple choice components, but I don't think they're going to go back to that format because it's just too many essays to grade. And they want to turn the results around as quickly as they can. Your 3 essays in the morning will come from all of those subjects or could come from, all of those subjects that are listed. And I do mean all of those subjects that are listed for Florida. There is no requirement that any subject be tested in a particular form on the Florida portion. The only requirement that Florida has is that you must be tested on the rules of civil and criminal procedure, Florida civil and criminal procedure. They have always tested civil and criminal procedure in multiple choice form. One multiple choice component, meaning approximately 30 questions, mixed civil and criminal procedure. They aren't required to, though. I looked at the rules on that particular point recently. They don't have to, but they will. They're not going to give you an essay, famous last words. Should never say never when it comes to the bar exam, but I can't imagine that they're going to give you an essay on civil and criminal procedure. Everything else could be tested in essay form, which includes evidence, which includes business entities, which includes wills administration. And in fact, all of those subjects, once upon a time, were tested in essay form. They have not tested evidence in essay form since the early 80s. I don't think they're going back. They have not tested wills administration or business entities in essay form since the early 90s, and I doubt that they're going back. But understand that they could, and from time to time, for example, a trust essay has wills administration component to it. And in fact, we're going to do a question later that combines them so we can do a little review of both. So don't freak out if you see something that you thought was going to be in multiple choice form show up in essay form. And in addition, even though for the last 25 years or so, the other two multiple choice components have been drawn from evidence, business entities, and wills administration. They could add something new in multiple choice form without telling you. They cannot add a new subject without telling you, but they can change the testing format without telling you. So once again, don't freak out. For example, I've always thought that family law is something they could test in multiple choice form. They never have. But now with dependency, how are they going to test dependency? How are they going to test juvenile law? Yeah, they could throw all that together, possibly, in a multiple choice component. I don't think they're going to, but again, don't freak out. Again, you're a duck, let the water roll off your back, just roll with whatever they give you. And Florida con law, which they are almost certainly going to test this time. Once upon a time, 1983 to be exact, they tested Florida con law in multiple choice form. Ooh, fortunately, I didn't take that exam, but the people who did said it was awful. So even though they have never gone back to testing Florida con law in multiple choice form since that time, they could if they wanted to be really mean. So where does that leave us? Back to the 3 essays in the morning. Remember, they can and they do test up to 3 subjects per question. So you can have 9 subjects now in your essays. And honestly, when I read some of the essays questions, I see 4 or 5 subjects, even though they say they're limited to 3. So they have gotten very good at combining subjects. I'm going to give you some sense of what I think they're likely to test, but I can't be as precise as I used to be because of the way that they're combining subjects now, the way they can combine subjects. But what do I think they're going to hit? Well, let's start with what they tested last time. Surprisingly, never done it before. 2 questions with contracts. 2 questions clearly contracts-based. One was a straight-up contracts question combined with negotiable instruments, and the other was a warranty question. Now, it did involve goods, and so Article 2 was clearly part of the question. But warranty is always a hybrid of contract and torts, and people have been arguing since that time. If you go on the internet, look it up. People have been arguing about whether it was a contracts or a torts question. It was both, to be honest. So contracts really got tested seriously last time, and the other question was a trust question chock full with trust issues, and it was just all sorts of stuff. A charitable trust, there was an exculpatory clause. I can't even remember all the issues. I mean, they covered a lot of territory in that trust question, and both of the contracts questions had an ethical component. So what do I think they're going to test this time with that background in mind? Well, notice there was no Florida con law last time. They rarely go more than an exam without testing Florida con law. It's not required. Once upon a time it was, but it is no longer required. Come on. However, it is a very, very frequent flyer, so I think you're going to see Florida con law. In a couple of weeks, I think it's the 23rd or whatever that Friday is, as I mentioned last week, Judge Shepard is going to give his lecture, so make sure that you attend the lecture even if you took Florida con law, because I think that subject is something you're really going to see. What else? Well, family law was missing. Now, family law, it gets tested usually every other exam, sometimes a couple of exams in a row. I can't guarantee it's going to be there, but the reason that I'm kind of looking at family law is that the one new area that hasn't been tested yet is dependency and delinquency. The dependency, I think, we don't know, we have no clue really how they're going to test dependency, but it sure seems like it could be combined with family law. So I think family law / dependency is a good bet. Where does that leave you for the third question? In some kind of professional responsibility ethics thrown in somewhere in the mix. Property combined with whatever. Property combines with a lot of stuff. Contracts combines with everything. There's even a question from a ways back in which they combine contracts with Florida con law. They get very creative. But I think property with something else mixed in. You can have property with torts, you can have property with trust, you can have property with homestead, just all sorts of combinations. But property, I think, is definitely something to keep an eye on. What's least likely to be tested this time, actually, I think, is trust. I'm not going to ignore it. We're going to do a trust question with wills administration because I think that's what you're going to get hit with. But there was so much packed into the trust question in July that I think that one might not get tested. Contracts, you know, that's your other one. You could see a little bit of contracts someplace. What they, you know, the examiners know what people like me are saying. They know what our predictions are, and they love to go against what we predict. And so everybody's saying, well, they had 2 contracts questions last time. There's no way they're going to have contracts again. Well, you know, they could. And contracts thrown into some other question, very, very possible. So for essays, highest on the list, I think your Florida con law is definitely up at the top. I think family law is up there. Property maybe a little rung below, but definitely still there. And when I say family law, don't forget about that dependency or possibly the juvenile delinquency. And then torts would be the other option, property or torts, because they had a torts question, but it was certainly mixed with contracts. So that's essay. Now, multiple choice, your afternoon. 100 multiple choice questions, but 90 of those 100 questions count. 10 they deem to be experimental, and they throw them out. So you will have approximately 30 civil / criminal procedure questions. You will have that. And then you will have 2 other components, 30 questions each, usually drawn from the pool of evidence, Florida evidence, wills administration, and business entities. Last time they tested business entities and evidence. Because I don't think there's going to be a trust essay this time, Will's administration looks like a good bet. Once, only once, did they have Will's administration and trusts together on the exam. They usually don't. So since trust isn't as likely, I think you want to be prepared for Will's administration. Sometimes, every 4 or 5 years, they test Will's administration and business entities, and they leave evidence off. I don't think they're going to do that this time. Kind of looking at the patterns, I don't think they're ready yet to leave evidence off. But that means still that you want to be prepared for all 3 of those. Because people always want to know, what don't I need to study? North Dakota law, maybe? You know, you got to study everything. But those are the likely percentages. Now, one final comment, and then I'll take your questions. The grading part. This confuses everybody, and honestly, I can't give you a completely straight answer. I'll tell you the party line that the bar examiners give and make a few comments on it. 100 points for each of the 3 essays, so that's 300 points maximum. And then 90 points maximum for the 3 multiple choice components, which they then squeeze down, scale down to 200 points. Why? Because you have 200 points from the MBE and then now 200 points from Florida, which gives you that the compensatory model that averages out, you hope, at least 136. How do they squeeze the 390 points down to 200? It's all very mysterious. And they do what they call iterations. The Supreme Court sets some standards, and then they tell the examiners, and the examiners keep running the numbers until they get what the Supreme Court wants. But it is done approximately in the following fashion, which is what the examiners say. And we had the math department in the university run our scores some years ago to see if what the examiners told us was true, and it's at least approximately true. They weight everything so that each of the 6 parts in Florida has equal weight. Now remember, you have 3 essays worth 100 points each, 3 multiple choice components worth 30 points each. And so they scale the essay down more than they do the multiple choice, so that, again, each of those 6 parts ends up being approximately equal in value. And again, they do that through what they call iterations, which explains a couple of things. When you get your score back, they no longer break out the MBE, which is a pity, but you'll get a raw and a scaled score on the MBE. You're going to get a raw and a scaled score in Florida, and at least for your exam, Florida is still breaking it out. You're going to see a raw score of perhaps 170, scaled down to 137. How did I lose all those points? Well, again, they're taking the 390 and squeezing it down to 200. And 2 people might have that raw score of 170. One gets scaled down to 137, and one gets scaled down to 135, the dreaded 135. How is that possible? Well, it depends on where the point came from. Whether you had more points in essay, more points in multiple choice. So understand that your Florida scale score will be lower than your Florida raw score, and understand that your scaled Florida score might be different from a scaled Florida score of somebody who had the identical raw score. So you can't freak out about that kind of stuff. Now, in contrast, the MBE is scaled up. You start out with the raw score, and they're going to scale it up. How do they do that? By throwing out certain questions. They also have what they call experimental questions, which are sometimes not experimental questions, but they just don't perform well. And they're going to scale somewhere between 10 and 20 points up. I can never tell you exactly how much because they don't know how much. And it depends on how well you do on the MBE portion of the exam. If you start out with a 170 raw, you might get scaled up just 5 more points because you got so many right to begin with. If you start out with a 120 raw, you're going to get scaled up somewhere between 10 to 15 points, which might get you where you need to get. Also understand that you can't get a score, scaled score, that's below 100. But you don't want to be that person, okay? You do not want to be that person. They automatically bump you up to 100 if you do really, really poorly. Understanding, of course, that 100 isn't going to get you where you need to get. So that's how the scoring on the 2 parts goes. And then, of course, they take the 2, add them together, and average them out. And can you get a 135.5 average? Yes. You may know somebody who got the 135.5 average. It happens. And you fail if you get 135.5 average. Understand that. If you get a 135, say on Florida, and a 136 on the MBE, averaged out, that's 135.5, you failed. So you don't want that to happen to you. Questions before we jump into contracts and torts? Questions?
The score that counts is the scale.
The score that counts is the scale. Absolutely correct.
And are you competing with everyone else, or how exactly does that work?
In terms of the scaling is done across the board, and I think you're probably referencing the MBE scaling more than the Florida. Florida is just a formula to get it down to 200. The MBE scaling, you're competing against everybody in the nation. So the scaling that they do will affect every applicant across the country exactly the same. So, for example, suppose that there is a really off-the-wall rule against perpetuities question, okay? And they look at the results and they say, nah, we're going to throw this question out. Everyone across the country now gets a point, unless you happen to be the person who got that question right to begin with. Because you don't get an extra point if you already got it right, but if you got it wrong. So the answer choice is C. And let's suppose that 2% of the nation picked C and everybody else picked D. They might scale that question out. 98% of the exam population gets an extra point. The 2%, no. Other questions? Yes, sir.
What happens if you pass one but not the other?
If you pass one but not the other, you have passed that portion. And you do not, as long as you pass the other portion within the 25 months, you don't have to retake. It depends on you as an individual. As you can retake the part you passed, you don't have to. And it depends on you as an individual. It depends on whether you passed MBE or Florida. That's a bridge I cross with people at a later date. However, there is one other thing to consider. Not suggesting it necessarily for any individual, but it is something to keep in mind. And if you think it's something that you might need, I want you to come talk to me or talk to Amar. You can, as a first-time taker in Florida, you can sit for just the MBE portion. You cannot sit for just the Florida portion. If you're going to do Florida portion, then you have to do Florida and MBE, but you can do just MBE. Now, right now, I'm not telling anybody to take that approach, but it can help. If you find that you're drowning as you go along, and you know you're not going to be fully prepared for Florida because you haven't yet mastered MBE, talk to me, talk to Amar. Because if you take just the MBE portion and you pass just the MBE portion, you have a pass. And importantly, psychologically, and importantly, especially for jobs, you do not count as a failure. And as you go out and as you interview with your prospective employers, they're going to want to know, did you pass or fail the exam on your first try? If you take just the MBE part and you pass it, and then the next time you take the Florida part and you pass it, you are a passing student. You have never failed the bar exam. And in this job market, employers, a lot of employers, won't even look at people who have failed the bar exam. Does it delay your passage a little bit? Yes. But if you fail, it delays it anyway, and then you have to deal psychologically yourself with the burden of failing, and again, in terms of the job market. So while I'm not recommending it for anybody at this point, it can be a viable tool for certain individuals. Let us know if you think you fall in that category. Other questions? Yes, ma'am.
What are the passing points and what you need for each?
136 on each to pass.
That's average though, right?
That's average. So, and remember, I gave you the example of a 135 on Florida and a 136 on the MBE. That's an overall fail. But if you get a 135 on Florida and a 137 on the MBE, or vice versa, averages out at 136, you've passed. Even though you failed Florida, you are the Florida portion, you have still passed the Florida bar exam. Now, I want to caution, because the wheels are churning. Don't put all your eggs in one basket. And a lot of people are going to tell you to do exactly that. Just load up on the MBE, don't worry about Florida. Big, big mistake. A lot of people who do that you might get that 140 on the MBE. Then you get the 120 on Florida, and you're still out of luck. So you cannot assume, no matter what percentage you're getting right on the MBE, you cannot presume that you don't need to worry about Florida. That's number one. And number two, if you are not a good essay writer, don't assume that you can pass Florida based on the Florida multiple choice. They are off the wall, the Florida multiple choice questions. They are not written in MBE form. They're weird. That's all there is to it. And they test obscure stuff, which we'll talk about more later on. You need, and when I say you, everybody, we talk to people at other schools across the board at every single school in the state of Florida, whatever the school is, law school. People pass or fail Florida on the basis of the essays. You need to write 3 good essays and do an okay job on the multiple choice to pass the Florida portion. Question?
For the multiple choice in Florida questions, are they yes, yes, no, no, or?
No, they're weird.
How do you prepare for them?
You prepare, it's a good question. You prepare for them, but you go to the outlines. Now, your commercial courses, whatever they are, will have given you some Florida questions. You're going to run out of Florida questions very quickly. Doesn't matter what course you're in. And people always say, why aren't there more Florida? Well, it's because it's really hard to write bad questions. And you'll see I've written, some questions that we're going to do on certain Florida subjects. I have written some multiple choice questions. But it's very difficult to duplicate the way those questions are written in Florida. They are not written in MBE form. So you need to go back to the outlines and learn the law from the outlines. Now, I talked about outlines on Monday and how important they are and why they're important. Whatever anybody else says to you, don't assume that you can learn all you need to learn by just doing questions. Big mistake, huge mistake. Go back to those outlines, get the detail and the substance, and get it organized. And how do you get it organized? From the outlines. Okay, yes, sir. Yeah.
Can you explain the curve a little bit? It's a curve, right? It's not a curve.
Now, Florida, as I mentioned the Florida Supreme Court before, the Florida Supreme Court is going to decide whether you pass or fail. Florida Supreme Court is the body that sets the pass rate. They tell the bar examiners, we want X percentage to pass. That's how they do it. For the Florida, the Florida Supreme Court can't affect the scores on the MBE, of course. But they figure out how many they want to admit, and that's how they do it. It's how they're the Florida Supreme Court. They decide admissions. You are approximately somewhere 75%. It was low this last time. But the pass rate in Florida is going to be somewhere in that ballpark. Which means then that you have to be in that top 70 to 75%. And I can't tell you what the Supreme Court's going to do this time. I really can't. I can tell you that a lot of jurisdictions, Florida included, were thrown for a bit of a loop because of the low MBE scores last time, which again, if you go on the internet, you may have already heard about it. The MBE scores were low this past time, which did affect bar passage rates then in the various states, because the states themselves can't fiddle with the MBE scores, just the Florida scores. MBE is going to be tough for you guys, especially because they're adding Civ Pro. And understand that the questions, as I mentioned on Monday, the questions that people saw on the MBE portion of the exam in July, people walked away and said, wow, they were hard. We didn't see questions like these questions in our practice. So what's the moral of the story? Do you need to do questions? Yes, of course. You got to practice. But do you rely just on doing questions so you recognize them when you go into the exam? No way, no how. You can do 5,000 questions and fail the MBE very easily. Learn the law. Learn it from the outlines, then practice on the MBE questions. Okay, let's do some contracts and some torts. I picked contracts and torts to start with because they're, especially contracts, it's more generic than some of the other subjects that we're going to do. And I'm realizing, again, that depending on your commercial course, you may or may not have covered this material. You're okay if you haven't covered the material in what we're going to do today. We're going to work together. But again, there is usually a good place to start. So what do you do with your essay packet? You are going to get 3 questions in a packet. And it's going to have a colored cover on it. I don't know if it's going to be green or orange or whatever. And there will be 3 questions inside of it. You open it up. Now what do? Well, first of all, you can do the questions in whatever order you choose to do them in. There's no requirement that you do question 1 first. So take a look at them, because you may see a question that you go, wow, I absolutely can nail this question, or you may see a question that looks like it's written in Greek. So take a quick look. What you don't want to do, though, is stop and start and stop and start. Once you start on a question, finish it. And really important, allocate 1 hour, 1 hour, 1 hour. In law school, when you have multiple questions on an exam, sometimes, you know, if you do really good on question number 1, professor lets you slide a little bit on number 2. Your questions are going to be graded by different people, operating totally independently. So you can't just load up on question 1 and leave question number 3 in the dirt. And I see it happen all the time. I see people spend an hour and a half on the first question and then a half hour on, you know, the next one. Bad idea. 1 hour, 1 hour, 1 hour. And as you practice, when you get to that point where you're doing timed questions, which you really shouldn't be doing yet, then work with that in mind. So then, let's say we're going to do question number 1. What do? Make a good outline. The most important thing is to make a good outline before you start to write, which sounds like a scary thing, and I'll speak from personal experience. It was for me when I was in law school, because you're thinking, how can I possibly take the time to make a good outline and then write a good answer? You can't afford not to make a good outline. And how much time should you take making the outline? Half hour. Remember, you got an hour for the question. Half hour, which sounds like way too much time, but it's not. For this reason. What is it that takes all the time when you're writing an essay question? The thinking, right? You're going to write 3 or 4 pages or type 2 or 3 pages, which you can do in 15 minutes if you're not thinking. It's the thinking that takes all the time. Do all of your thinking up front and make a really good outline. Make the outline in IRAC fashion. Don't just jot a couple of issues or a few rules or a few conclusions. Issue, rule, analysis, conclusion. Had an interesting email conversation earlier today with somebody, one of your classmates who graduated last May. And she sent me an essay to read, and I said, well, okay, you spotted the issues. You got some rules down, and you jumped right to the conclusions. And she said, you know, people have been telling me that since my first year in law school. And she said, but you know what I realized? And she finally realized it. She said, I never put the facts in my outline. And so then I'm trying to put them into the answer on the fly when I'm typing, and it doesn't work. Well, there you go. She figured it out on her own, and she won't make that mistake anymore. You actually put the facts into the outline. So issue, rule, analysis, conclusion in the outline, which does take a little while. But if it's in the outline, it's going to show up in your answer. You do all of the thinking first, and then you just write or type, which doesn't take very long. Now, where do you make that outline? Good question. How many of you are doing ExamSoft? Yeah, almost everybody. Okay. If you're handwriting, then you just make a handwritten outline. If you're using ExamSoft, try it out. And you probably had your technique in law school. Some people make a separate handwritten outline, which honestly is what I would do for the bar exam if I were taking it now and typing. And I'll explain why in a second. Other people kind of make the outline in the answer and fill in the blanks. Can save you time if you organize it on the screen, no question about it. But you have to be really careful. And as a person who grades a lot of essays, I'm going to tell you one of the biggest errors that I see people make in ExamSoft is they map out the answer in block form on the computer, and they forget to go back and fill in certain places. And over again, I'll see somebody, for example, suppose it's an adverse possession question, and so they map out open and notorious, actual, exclusive, hostile, continuous, et cetera. And then they fill in as they go along, but they forget to go back and fill in, for example, exclusive. They missed it. And so then there's just this heading, exclusive. Well, you just lost all those points. So if you are making your outline on the computer, be so careful to go back and fill in all the blocks. Why would I probably, and I have horrible handwriting that I can't read half the time, let alone anybody else, but why would I do a handwritten one? Because then it's sitting right here as I type, and I type, from the outline, which to me is the ideal way to write the answer, because that outline is your answer. You just fill in the blanks, make complete sentences. But try it. See what works for you. Just promise me that you won't start typing right away. Big mistake. Yes, sir?
Since it's a test of points instead of, like, they don't take points away.
Right.
How
Yeah.
much, I don't want to call it fluff.
Yeah.
Like, as an example,
Yeah.
says like, you're going into the damages part for remedies, and then like, this is a contract formation, you want to kind of make it applicable, but just throw out little zingers like punitive damages are typically not allowed in contracts.
That one,
unless,
yeah,
you
right.
know, gross negligence.
It's a really good question, Chris. Use your judgment. You don't have a lot of time. What they don't want is, here's everything I learned in my bar prep class about contracts. That's useless, right? And so, for example, suppose that, and you're going to see the question we do today is kind of straddling the line, but suppose that you have a question that is so clearly about land. It's a contracts/property question dealing with a contract for the sale of land. Do not waste time in saying, well, but if this were a question about goods, then the firm offer rule might apply. Waste of time. You will not get any points. And
But in the beginning, if you designate, common law is going to apply because this is real estate in the event it was goods, UCC would apply.
No.
Don't throw that in.
no, that gets you no points at all. Unless you have a question like we have here, because I actually have a question that could be either goods or services.
Probably different.
Yeah. Now, understand that the person who is grading the essay is not the person who wrote the question. The grader is somebody, it's going to be probably some of you sitting in this room, somebody who took the exam recently and who did really well on the exam. And we have, over the past few years, we've had a number of graders from St. Thomas, which is something that I wouldn't want to do. But you can't refuse the bar if they ask. It's a huge honor because it shows that they have great respect for you. The grader has 300 essays to grade in a short period of time. That's horrible. That's why I say I wouldn't want to do it. And what they do to begin with, and I participated a few years ago in a mock grading session, so I do know how this part goes. They do what they call calibration sessions. They take these people and they lock them away for a weekend. And they grade approximately 40 essays. I think that's what we had in a short period of time with the grading outline. The person who writes the question writes a grading outline with point allocations. And then the graders try to use that grading outline. And your goal, by the way, is going to be to duplicate the grading outline in your answer. Again, why you want to outline before you start to write. Then they come back together and they go around the room and they say, okay, everybody got point A, and yeah, 10 points, that makes sense for point A. Nobody got point B, but you know what? It's really important, so we should keep it in. Nobody got C, and you know, it's too obscure. And then somebody will say, well, I had 5 questions that talked about D, and it's not in the grading outline. Then they'll decide whether D should be included if the question's broad enough to include D, or whether those people were just off on a tangent. And they set and calibrate the grading outline. Once the grading outline has been calibrated in that session, the grader is absolutely stuck to what's in the grading outline. So, to talk about things that aren't in the grading outline, you just wasted time and space. And you'll never know for sure what's in the grading outline, but you want to let the facts tell you what should be in the grading outline. The grader cannot, you know, when I read an essay, if somebody comes up with something creative I haven't thought of, you know, oh, that's kind of interesting. But if it didn't make it past the calibration session, they cannot give you any points at all for it. Why do they do it that way? Because each grader has 300 essays, and they have to achieve a certain amount of uniformity, otherwise it's not a fair process. So understand again that kitchen sink doesn't help. In fact, it can hurt. Why? You think, well, you know, let me show them what I know. As we sat around a table. At the tables, we had a law professor, that was me. Each table had a law professor, a judge, a member of the Board of Bar Examiners, and a practitioner. So they had different kinds of lawyers at each table. And we actually talked as we were grading. And every time somebody came to an essay that was just shoveling it, you know what I mean by shoveling it, the grader would say, well, this person doesn't know what the real issues are. And every time the grader came across an essay that said, well, it might be this, and I don't know, it might be that, and people write, well, I'm not sure, but I think it could be, you know, the overuse of those, what I call waffle words. Once again, a signal to the grader that the writer didn't know what he or she was talking about. So you've got to focus in, let the facts be your guide. The facts are always the guide. And address what appears to need addressing. Don't waste a lot of time on all that other stuff that you learned that you want to show that you know, because it isn't going to get you points. And make sure, issue, rule, analysis, conclusion, make sure that you show some analysis. If you do not, you have given away a lot of points. A couple of final issues, and then we're going to do the contracts questions. You got to know Florida law. Now, we're going to see in the contracts question that there isn't much that's different. That's what's nice about contracts. But the torts question, we're going to see a lot of Florida law. And don't even try to sit down and write a Florida essay on a topic on a Florida topic until you've reviewed the Florida distinctions. And most of the questions, contracts aside, most of the questions are going to require a good knowledge of Florida law. If you don't have that knowledge, you will not get a passing score. You can't just fake it and write accepting contracts, a generic common law essay, and expect to pass the Florida portion. Okay, any general questions? All right, so, oops, let me grab a packet from over here. What I'm going to ask you to do is to pull from the back of the contracts packet, which is the one that says February 1985 contracts question, pull the essay question. And notice, by the way, it's really short. You will see, while the Florida multiple choice questions are not written in MBE style, the Florida Board of Bar Examiners is using MEE, multi-state essay exam style questions, which means they're very short, simple, to the point, and generally speaking are going to have a fairly pointed call of the question. So understand that all facts matter. There will not be irrelevant facts in your fact pattern. So read it very carefully, spot the issues. I'm going to give you a few minutes to do that, and then we'll come back together and talk about what you're seeing. Sorry. That thing. Oops, is it?
I didn't know that.
the better job you're going to do in analyzing it. So we've got Alan Abel. He runs a successful business. He supplies and installs chalkboards, bulletin boards, etc. Well, right there, I look at that question and I go, uh-oh. Because he supplies and installs chalkboards. What am I thinking when I read that sentence?
Goods or services?
Goods or services, you bet, because he does both, okay? Now, usually, when they give you a contracts question, it's going to be clear it's goods or it's services. Every once in a while, they give you a question like this one. And sometimes, surprisingly, more often than you might think, they'll give you a question that has one part that's goods and one part that's services. This one, though, we're not sure. You're going to see in my answer, and as we go through, the answers, by the way, will go into more detail than you could write in an hour. The reason that I do that is a lot of people use these as study guides. So you're going to see that I go through the analysis fully for common law and fully for Article 2. You probably would not have time in an hour's time to run down both sides. So you would have to make a decision up front, pick a side, and go with it. Exactly. And and interestingly, there's enough in this question that you could write either side and have plenty to talk about. Yes, sir.
Would you mention that, though?
Yes, actually, I would, because you're going to do that first analysis. Remember last week, the very first thing that you address in any contracts question is governing law. So you're going to have to decide what the governing law is here using the predominantly sales or services test. Which is the one I would recommend. If you used Gravamen or some form of that in your contracts class, they're looking for predominantly sales or services. And so then you will have already alerted them to the fact that you know it could be one or the other, but then you're going to pick one and go with it. Because you just don't have time to do both sides. So with that in mind, Abel learns that Nifty Contractors is accepting subcontracting bids for chalkboards incident to a project to construct a school building on which Nifty itself intends to bid. Now, they're setting up a typical general contractor, subcontractor bid issue, and you know somebody, as soon as I read that sentence, I know somebody's going to make a mistake in the bid. It's so typical a fact pattern. That helps. So if you can, remember cases again, it doesn't matter what case book you had some of these contractor cases, and it all comes down to the issue of what kind of mistake? Unilateral mistake, right? So if you know those patterns as you pick it out in the fact pattern, you already know where you're going to go with your essay. So why I keep stressing how important it is to let yourself remember cases. You don't need case names. They're useless at this point. But fact patterns and what issues are associated with fact patterns matters a lot. So Abel telephones Nifty's president with a bid of $100,001 to supply and install the chalkboards. Now, that telephone call is a what? It's not an oral contract yet. Can't be, can it? The question is it an offer? So in a contracts question, first thing you have to identify is your governing law. The next thing you talk about is contract formation, offer, acceptance, consideration. The nice thing about contracts is that any contracts question follows the same arc. You already know going in, if you get a contracts question, you know how to write it. Governing law, formation, offer, acceptance, consideration, defenses to formation and enforcement. We'll talk about the difference between the two of them. Then the performance phase, and then breach and remedies. Every contracts question goes in that order. You should never walk into the exam with canned answers. But you should walk in with game plans for typical fact patterns. And you can get those game plans by looking at past essays in your commercial books. You are not going to be able to write every single past essay that's out there, because it goes back in the books 30-odd years. But you should read them, the ones that you don't write, so you get used to the fact patterns, so you know what outline you should have in mind as you sit down to do the question, because that's going to speed up the process. If you already know how you're going to write a bid question, you've saved a lot of time. So he makes that bid of $100,001 to supply and install the chalkboards. Now I'm looking at that, and maybe it's an offer, but I look at $100,001 to supply and install the chalkboards. Well, I teach contracts. Contracts professor in me right away says what? What's not there?
The writing?
Well,
That's another question.
yeah, eventually we're going to get to the writing. But right now we don't have to have writing because but an offer, what does an offer have to have? First of all, you have to have intent, objectively judged. Second thing is, however your professor taught it, I like to say,
Communicate to the offeree.
well, that's the third one. Content, I say definite terms, but content means the same thing. Now, if we're talking about common law, maybe we have an offer here. If we're talking about Article 2, what's missing? Quantity, the one essential term under Article 2. Look for what's in the facts, or in this case, what's not in the facts. Quantity is a serious problem in this question if it's an Article 2 question. An almost insurmountable problem. So think about those things as you read. NIFTY receives two other bids of $123,000 and $137,000 and uses Abel's bid. Of course, NIFTY would use Abel's bid. It's the low one. But $123,000, $137,000 might suggest something to at least some of you. What is it suggesting to you? 101,000, 123, 137. There's,
Could you have known?
thank you. Yeah, with unilateral mistake under the common law, the only time that unilateral mistake can be used as a defense is if the other party knew or should have known. Now, interestingly, in the past when I've used this question, sometimes I have people who have experience in the construction business, and I have had people say that that kind of gap should have put the GC on notice here. You might not know that, and you aren't necessarily expected to know it, but you see a gap, and so you know you should at least talk about it. And of course, at a minimum, it is setting up the mistake. Now, NIFTY uses Abel's bid. What is that fact there for? What's it trying to suggest to you? Maybe, but don't start there. Was it an acceptance? Really important. Hi, Susie. Yeah, we're kind of still in the first question, so go ahead. Just leave the pizza. You can take that and have a nice weekend. Maybe it's. Oh yeah. Maybe leave a couple just in case. Maybe it's an acceptance, but you have to ask yourself. The offer is, if it's an offer for what kind of a contract? Is it an offer for a bilateral contract, an offer for a unilateral contract? It matters, right? Because they have different forms of acceptance. Look at everything you have to do in this question. That's why I like this question. It's an old question, but it's a really good one. So as we get into it in more detail, we're going to talk about what result if it's an offer for a bilateral contract, promise for promise. What result if it's an offer for a unilateral contract, promise for an act. Thanks, Susie. NIFTY, of course, is awarded the contract because NIFTY's going to come in with the low bid and publishes in a trade journal the names of subcontractors whose bids it used in submitting its own successful bid. It's a sort of a strange fact, but
It's important.
well,
Because if you are going to say if that was acceptance is valid, you can't revoke now because
Okay.
it's heard from our last.
Right. But mere publication of the name, is that going to be acceptance? It's not. So that much I can tell you. So again, you got to dig into the facts. But of course now Abel sees the item and he realizes that he made a mistake. And he should have submitted a bid of 131 instead of 101, which would put him in the ballpark in between the other two bids. So now he's made a mistake. And he made the mistake, which means it is what kind of mistake again? Unilateral. It's not a mutual mistake, and the rules are very different. Mutual mistake, both parties have to be mistaken. Nifty simply relied on Abel's mistake. Makes it a unilateral mistake. Got to make the distinction. Abel immediately phones Nifty and says he can't do the work for 101 as he would only make a few cents on the job, and he withdraws the offer. Can you do so? Not if it's been accepted or not. Now the reliance starts to become important. And remember, whether you're talking about MBE or Florida, never go to Reliance first. That's a first-year law school student mistake. First-year students always want to talk about Reliance. It's something everybody gets. If the contract was formed at law, you don't need Reliance. You reach Reliance only if the contract was not formed at law. Very important for MBE purposes as well. As you're sifting through your answer choices, do not pick the Reliance choice unless there's no way that the contract was formed at law. And he says, well, I'm not going to make any money. Do we care? Not really. So now Nifty consults you as to whether Abel is bound to furnish the chalkboards for 101. The only part of this question, and it is because it's an old question, is the discuss. They're not going to give you such an open-ended call of the question anymore. They're going to be more specific. And of course, again, omit discussion of any applicable statutory bidding regulations. Oftentimes they'll give you instructions like that. Because how many of you, is there anybody who knows, and I would include myself in it, anything about statutory bidding regulations? No. All right, so let's start now to unfold the question. And notice what I've got up here, what I talked about before: governing law, contract formation, defenses to enforcement and formation, and here remedies. I skipped over the performance phase, kind of going back to Chris's question. Why did I skip it? There's no performance in this case. They didn't get that far. So I'm not going to talk about it. I don't have time to talk about it. And it's not going to do any good to say, well, if he had made a non-conforming delivery, then, you know, who cares? But we care about all the rest of this. And, of course, you never skip governing law. But suppose that they tell you there was a validly formed contract. Then don't spend 5 pages talking about offer and acceptance. Again, let the facts talk to you. Yes, sir?
So in your, in the calibrating session, if somebody's, you know, if say, for number's sake, 20 kids out of 100 called this a UCC problem instead of a common law problem, would they have like this bifurcation and say, okay,
right,
these will be UCC answers and these will be...
you mean, no, what they'll do is
They'll
the grading outline will say you can go down this path or that path.
Okay.
Yeah, exactly, exactly.
So even if you get it wrong...
Right, correct.
Right.
That's correct. Now, there are going to be some places...
As long as you believe it, you're right.
Yeah, no, absolutely correct, and that's a good point. In some areas, when it comes to Florida law, there's a right answer and a wrong answer, right? I mean, you know what the anti-lapse statute apply when it applies, you know it or you don't. But if there is a fork in the road, a legitimate fork in the road, which there is in this question, as long as you defend the position well that you've taken, that's all you need. All right, so let's take a look at governing law, which is a big part of this question. Usually it isn't. And usually you can do sort of a generic one short paragraph for governing law, but always begin with it. Here, we're going to have to go into it in more detail. So here is, by the way, the generic paragraph you would use if it were clearly Article 2. You start by saying, what Article 2 applies to. If it's clearly common law, don't bother with what Article 2 applies to. But here it could be, since it's chalkboards. Article 2 applies to transactions and goods. Goods are all things movable. In this case, chalkboards are movable, therefore good. And once again, if we stopped right there, and if it were to deliver 100 chalkboards, clearly an Article 2 question, there's your first paragraph. And once again, you don't want a canned answer, but any governing law, any Article 2 governing law question is going to look like that. Yes, sir?
I went a little different because when my mind went, as soon as I saw that it didn't have a quantity.
Oh, we're going to, but don't start there. Why don't we start with quantity? Because quantity is an issue for the offer, not for the governing law. Right? So you got to go in order. And I promise you, if you use the structure that I have in this answer, and you use it for your answer should you get a contracts question, you're going to rack up the points, because this is what the grading outline will look like. So you got to go in order. And here, we don't get to quantity until we get to the offer part, and then it becomes very important. So now, however, we got goods and services combined. So what do? Use again, here you would use predominantly sales or services. There are other tests out there. Again, you may have stressed those other tests in your contracts class, but if they test this particular point, they will want you to use predominantly sales or services. So how do we decide? There are some factors. They aren't the only factors, but they are commonly used factors. So once again, I'd go with the commonly used factors. First, we look at the contract itself, which we don't have here. Not particularly helpful, unfortunately. But if the contract talks in terms of goods more than it talks in terms of services, or vice versa. We look at the nature of the business of the supplier. What is it that the supplier does? Does the supplier just deliver goods, or does the supplier also install goods? Which, it's a little bit of both in this question. And then finally, which we don't have, unfortunately, in this question, I wish they had included it, is the value of what's being supplied. Is most of the money that's being paid for the contract, is it being allocated to the goods part, the chalkboards, or is it being allocated to the services part, the installation? So at a minimum, again, you list the factors, work with the facts as you have them. It's not clear in this question. I honestly don't know what they thought it was, goods or services, or whether they really had an opinion. So my conclusion, it's a big if here, because I want to be able to explore both sides for the purposes of my master answer, if you will. You would pick one, and then you'd go with it. Now, once you've picked your governing law, now we go to formation, offer, acceptance, consideration, and notice that option contract does become an issue under the second restatement, at least. So, offer. We already said what an offer has to have. It's got to have those three elements. Analyze each element separately. Don't give a list of a bunch of rules and then a bunch of facts. It's when you bring them together that you show good analysis. So, intent. How do we define intent? Of course, we all know it has to be judged objectively. It's not an issue in this case, so I wouldn't spend a lot of time on it, because it's very clear that there was objective intent. But notice what I've done. In each case, I break it down. I take the first element, intent. I state the rule, I apply it to the facts, and then I conclude. A series of mini IRACs. That's what makes your analysis really pop off the page. You want your answer to be as user-friendly as possible. Have pity on your grader. Remember, this is somebody, and they're young practitioners. They've got a real job. And then they got to grade this stuff on the weekends. Not fun. So have pity on your grader. Make it as easy as possible.
And sorry, it is good to slow down, because on some of these samples, they'll if the facts are, yes, it's a form contract, they'll walk through it fast. But if it's kind of like this, you do want to slow down, hit every single
Yeah.
point.
This question is clearly designed to make you walk through all the parts of formation. You gotta, again, you gotta pay attention to that's another reason why you don't start writing too quickly. Because you've got to figure out how many issues there are and which ones are the important ones, which one you want to spend a lot of time on, which ones you can short a little bit. So, offer. Now, Willie, we get to the fact that quantity is missing. And again, I've bifurcated here. I say if it's Article 2, here's the result. If it's common law, here's the result. You would pick one and go with it. So for those of you who think it's Article 2, then we know that the one essential term is quantity. And it's missing, which should leave you dead in the water. Because there's no gap filler for quantity. Article 2 has gap fillers for a whole lot of stuff, but no gap filler for quantity. Common law, whatever the essential terms are, which wouldn't include necessarily quantity, but you'd have to describe the services. And it just says install the chalkboards. I don't know. Maybe it's sufficient. But let's assume. And notice that honestly, in real life, you probably stop right there. You're done. There's no quantity. There's no description of the services. It's a really short answer, right? Too short. You know there are other issues. So you'd say, assuming that we get past those issues, then what happens next? And what happens next? Communicated to the offeree. That's easy. Picked up the phone. So let's assume we get past the issue of definite terms or content, if that's what you call it. Next question then is acceptance. And here we have to decide, again, is it an offer for a bilateral contract or an offer for a unilateral contract? I've given you both approaches. You might have to pick one and go with it. You might not have enough time to do both. But let's start with bilateral contract. Promise for a promise. And honestly, in a subcontractor-contractor setting, usually that's what happens. The offer is considered to be an offer for a bilateral contract, looking for a return promise. If that's the case, was there that manifestation of assent? Using the bid is not the same as manifesting assent. And if you look at the fact pattern, did NIFTY say, I accept your bid? Nope. So you probably don't have an acceptance. And if you think back to your contracts class, you will have talked about the practicalities of this particular area. When a general gets bids from subs, the general's got to use those bids to make the general bid. And he or she is going to use the lowest bid. But you don't want to lock the general into an acceptance at that point, because the general doesn't know yet whether he or she or it is going to get the general bid. If you lock the GC in at the subcontractor level before the general contract is awarded, the general contractor might be stuck, locked into a contract for goods he has no use for because he didn't get the general bid. So in reality, that use of the bid certainly is not going to be a promise to use the subcontractor. And the publication of the name, same thing. The mere publication of the name, that's not going to amount to an assent. So do I think there was an acceptance? No. Well, but we have to keep going, right? Even though we don't probably have an offer and we probably don't have acceptance, we have to keep going because there's other stuff to discuss. Now, what if it was an offer for a unilateral contract? Not likely. And honestly, if I were writing my answer, I probably wouldn't even bother, but I include it in case that's the way you were thinking. Offer for a unilateral contract, it's looking for performance in return. And NIFTY did something. NIFTY used the bid. But it's not the performance that was bargained for. What is the performance that Able was looking for on the part of NIFTY? Not use my bid, but rather what?
Pay 'em.
Use me, right? Use me in the job. So the mere use of the bid isn't the performance that Able was bargaining for. So once again, honestly don't think there was acceptance. But, so I can here I have to cover the issues because they clearly want you to cover the issues. If there was acceptance, consideration. Now, here's the one Florida thing we're going to talk about in contracts. And as you review contracts, you'll see there aren't very many Florida distinctions in contracts. Here's one place, definition of consideration. We have some additional statute of frauds categories. There are a few things here and there, but they're very minor, all things considered. But they are going to want you to know, if you have a contracts question, here's something you memorize. Florida follows the first restatement definition of consideration. And it's either a detriment to the promisee or a benefit to the promisor, not both. Second restatement says it's an and, not an or. What you will focus on in reality is the detriment to the promisor. All the cases do. And I have yet to find a case, and I've researched it, yet to find a case in Florida in which something was a detriment to the promisor, but not also a benefit, a detriment to the promisee, but not also a benefit to the promisor. They go hand in hand. But understand, again, show them you know Florida law, first restatement definition. In any event, if it's promise for a promise, then that's what we're talking about. And remember, when it comes to a bilateral contract, promise for a promise, the consideration lies in the promises, not in the performance. So a lot of people make that mistake. So the consideration is in the mutual promises. Promise of the seller supports the promise of the buyer, and vice versa. Now, in the end, even though consideration might be present, we have some serious problems because we got that quantity issue in terms of the offer. We've got acceptance issues. But there's a really important undercurrent in this question, which goes back to the point that Chris raised before, which is the reliance factor. And in particular, the restatement goes right to this issue in respect to construction contracts. Again, there's a whole body of case law on this particular point. It is a form of estoppel. Estoppel shows up in 3 different places in the restatement. One is the one that you all know, Section 90. Is there anybody who doesn't know Section 90? Promissory estoppel, right? There's also an estoppel section dealing with the statute of frauds, and then the third one, which is the option contract. And here's how it goes. If you have an offer that's made and the appropriate reliance is shown, the offer is converted from an offer that can be revoked at any time into an option contract. The reliance supplying the consideration that would normally be required to support the option contract. So what do you need? And that means then that the offeror cannot revoke the offer. The offeree does not have to accept the offer. It's one-sided. But the offeror can't revoke the offer, at least for a reasonable time. Remember, our offeror here is our subcontractor, Able. So what do we need? It's the reliance that Chris mentioned. You need the offer, first of all, of course. Then you need the reliance. Reliance has to be both reasonable and actual. Wherever you're using estoppel, reliance has to be both reasonable and actual. What do we think in this case? Was the reliance reasonable? You bet. If somebody gives you a subcontractor bid, then certainly if you use the bid, it's reasonable to expect that you would if it's the low one. So NIFTY reasonably relied here. Nifty actually relied because Nifty did use the bid. And you need that avoidance of injustice. Now think about Nifty in this case. If Able is allowed to withdraw the bid, what happens to Nifty? What does Nifty have to do? Contract with somebody else, right? At a much higher price, which means Nifty now is going to lose money on the general contract because Nifty's bid for the general contract was based on that 101,000, not 136,000 or whatever else. So clearly, Nifty would suffer an injustice, which means even though you've gone through all those steps and decided that offer and acceptance didn't occur in this case, nevertheless, Able may be bound through Section 89, you don't need the number, to what amounts to an option contract based on reliance. And notice, you reach this point, whether you're talking about Article 2 or common law, you end up at the same point, which means it's a good question. The person who drafted it left the ambiguity in terms of those initial 2 steps, but then brings it back home with the same solution, whichever governing law you apply. Now, we've decided that using the alternative of reliance, we have an enforceable offer or option contract. Now we need to talk about defenses to formation and enforcement. If you want to sound like you really know what you're talking about, you will distinguish between the two. A defense to formation says the contract was never formed in the first place. Mistake, which we'll talk about here. Minority. Fraud. No meeting of the minds, right? A defense to enforcement says, yes, an agreement was made, but it can't be enforced. The one that you'll be dealing with here, statute of frauds. We're going to focus in on unilateral mistake and statute of frauds. So starting with unilateral mistake, and I begin with the traditional rule. There is a traditional rule and a modern rule. Okay, so unilateral mistake. There's a traditional approach and then there's a modern approach. I give you both in here. I'll talk about both briefly. But honestly, if you wrote your answer with just the traditional approach, that's probably all you would need. Traditional approach, again, and remembering again, it's a unilateral mistake because only Able, the subcontractor, was mistaken. Nifty simply relied on the mistake that Able made. So if we have a unilateral mistake, traditional rule says that it is not a defense to formation, which means that Able can't withdraw the bid unless the other party knew or should have known about it. And clearly, Able did make a mistake in calculation here. The question is, did Nifty, sorry, let's go to the next page, did Nifty know about it? Nifty didn't actually know. The question is, should Nifty have had reason to know? Well, there's room for discussion here. And at this on this particular issue, since it's just a question of fact, and they didn't give you a lot to work with there, it would not matter what your conclusion is. But do draw a conclusion. They are looking for you to draw a conclusion. So you could say, yeah, he should have known there was a big enough gap. It's probably what they were aiming for there. But you could also say, well, you know, I don't know. I don't know anything about construction. I wouldn't say I don't know anything about construction. That's not a good idea. But there, you could say not enough facts to let us know whether the industry would recognize that as a significant gap. You could say that. But, you know, and notice, I did a little, it's a 23% difference. You would not be expected to do the math, but I just pointed out to you, because when you look at a 23% difference, that's a big difference, yeah. So I'm guessing that whoever drafted the question did think that Nifty should have known. So, and if Nifty knew, then that means that Able can withdraw the offer. But let's take a look at that modern approach, because there is a modern test. And the reason, especially why I like to include it here, first of all, I don't know. I don't have any case law to show whether Florida uses the traditional or the modern approach. I'm guessing they would use the traditional. But when you get to the MBE portion, sometimes you see this modern approach showing up in the way they structure the question. So you need a number of items. If you are the mistaken party under a unilateral mistake modern approach, first thing you have to show is that you, the mistaken party, you made a mistake, but it was not due to a neglect of a legal duty. For example, you're a lawyer and you didn't meet a filing date or something like that, you know, something that might amount to malpractice. Nothing here to suggest that this mistaken calculation was neglect of a legal duty. Second thing is unconscionability, hardship, some difficulty. And honestly, even though Abel says, oh, it's going to be a hardship on me, I'm not going to make any money on the contract, you focus in on the on the other party, which is Nifty in this case. And would there be, I'm sorry, here you're going to focus on Abel, apologize for that. Would there be a hardship on the person who's seeking excuse or seeking to escape the contract? And Abel says, I'm not going to make a lot of money, but that's not going to be sufficient. Third, you have to give notice, which in this case Abel did do. Obviously, if you're trying to avoid a contract, you have to let the other party know as soon as possible. And it's got to be, and this one's key, there's a lot of case law on this particular point. It's got to be a mistake of calculation, not judgment. And here it was a simple mathematical error. But if it was a mistake in calculating what kind of labor would be involved in installing the chalkboards, you can't seek an excuse if your judgment is poor. If your fingers slip on the calculator, another thing. And then finally, absolutely essential, you have to be able to restore the status quo, which is fatal here. There's no way you can go back to the status quo here because Nifty's general bid was already accepted. So using this modern approach, it would be very, very, very difficult for Abel to weasel out. Now, statute of frauds. Here again, I bifurcate, you pick one, you go with it. Starting with the common law. Do we need a writing for this particular contract if the common law applies? We don't. The only possible common law category that might even be considered here would be a contract
Over a year.
not to be performed within a year. And it's almost impossible to find a contract that cannot be performed within a year. There's so many holes in that rule. And the basic rule is that if there's any way, even if it's remote, that the contract can be performed within a year, a writing is not required. Well, there's nothing in this fact pattern to suggest that it's going to take 2, 3, 4 years to install these chalkboards. So if this is a common law contract, no writing is required. What about Article 2? For Article 2, and remember, whether you write it or you think it for the MBE, Article 2 requires a writing for a contract for the sale of goods $500 or more, not over 500. It's 500 or more, right at the on the dime. So easy to test on the MBE. You need a writing if it's $500. And what was the price here? 101. So yeah, you need a writing. But, always think of your buts, exceptions to the statute of frauds, right? What's the first exception? It's not applicable here, but what is the first exception? I'm sorry? Well, yeah, you're already down to 201 subpart 3. How about subpart 2? The merchant's exception. As between merchants, both parties have to be merchants. If one merchant sends a written confirmation to the other one that's sufficient against the sender, that's your first exception. We do have 2 merchants here, but no writing followed. So the merchant's exception doesn't apply. And by the way, remember last week, or at the beginning of the week, we talked about 2207. and said the objection has to be within a reasonable time. Merchant's exception to the statute of frauds, that's your 10-day rule. So the party receiving has to object within 10 days. Again, there was no writing to receive here, so 2201 subpart 2 doesn't apply. But subpart 3, yes, we've got 3 exceptions. Actually, the first is specially manufactured goods. Nothing here to suggest that the chalkboards are specially manufactured. The second is an admission in any kind of court document or court setting, which we don't have in this case. The third is part performance. Part performance? Nobody did anything here. What else should you be thinking about that's not in Article 2? The 2 exceptions to the statute of frauds at common law, part performance and estoppel. It's not called detrimental reliance, it's called estoppel, but yes. 2201 doesn't mention estoppel, and the courts are split. I have not found a Florida case that deals with this particular point. About half the courts say that that list, specially manufactured goods, admission, and part performance, that list doesn't include estoppel, and therefore estoppel is not an exception to the statute of frauds under Article 2. Half the courts say that. But the other half of the courts, and it really is 50-50, say, well, that list does not include estoppel. However, through Article 1, supplemental common law principles, and estoppel would be one of them, can come in as long as they're consistent. Well, estoppel at common law is a recognized exception to the statute of frauds. The question then would be, in this case, where do I have it? Whether estoppel, here's your section 139. Did we have a promise? Yes, in the form of the bid. Was there reliance? We already talked about it before. Yes. And do we have an injustice? Sure, same reason. And you're running out of time. You can refer back to the discussion that you had previously about the elements of estoppel. Now, we go to remedies, but we have to go through anticipatory repudiation. We have to show some kind of breach, or there's no reason to talk about remedies. And for anticipatory repudiation, you need 2 things, and it's absolutely essential, whether you're talking common law or Article 2, or whether you're talking Florida or MBE. 2 things. The contract, number 1, has to be executory on both sides. And for your multiple choice questions, that's how they get you. One party's already performed, the other party then says, I'm not going to perform on the due date. No anticipatory repudiation. Both parties have to have something left to do, which is certainly the case here. And you need an unequivocal, no, I will not perform, which Abel kind of said here. If you have those 2 things, contract that's executory on both sides and a repudiation that's unequivocal, no, I will not perform on the due date, then you have anticipatory repudiation. And of course, for anticipatory repudiation, what are the 4 options? Okay, you can treat the repudiation as a total breach and sue right away. You can suspend performance and wait for the due date. If you really need the chalkboards, maybe that's what you do. You can treat the repudiation as an offer to rescind, tear the contract up and walk away, or you can ignore the repudiation and urge the breaching party to perform. Sounds stupid, this last one, but once again, if you really need the goods, that's what you may need to do. Okay, questions on this question? All right, yes, ma'am.
You said in the exam you have to choose either common law or Article 2. Do you get penalized for choosing one or the other one?
Good question, and the answer is it depends. On this particular question, since it's legitimately, you can go either way legitimately, whichever one you would choose would be okay. if you have suppose, for example, that the question had been just about the sale of chalkboards. Well, if you say it's common law, you got a problem, right? Because it's clearly sale of goods. Or suppose that the question was about the sale of land, and you say, oh, it's Article 2. Well, that's wrong, right? But this question, because it could go either way, whichever one you choose would be okay. Sometimes they'll have a question like this, where you have several different paths you can take. Okay, let's take a very brief break. I know this is a lot. Most of these sessions, unfortunately, will go till about 6 o'clock. But if we take, a 5-minute break, we'll definitely be out of here by 6. And I will do, as soon as we come back, I'll do the drawing. Okay, once again, understanding that in real life you would take longer, let's go ahead so we can get out of here. And, whoops, wrong question. Let's take a look at the question. There's a lot that's going on in this question, a lot. A tough question to write in an hour. And you're also going to see I've added a few things that I have in parentheses, not within the call to question. The only reason that I even have them in the answer is people ask me. I've used this question before. I've updated it a million times, and it's an issue that people always ask about. So I put it in there again because people use these answers as study guides. So looking at the fact pattern, we've got Peter. He's driving to work one rainy February morning. Well, right away, you know where you're going with this question. You're going to have a crash, yeah. The distance is short, so he didn't fasten his seatbelt. Those of you who've studied or know Florida law, what is the seatbelt rule? Available and operational seatbelt. Failure to wear, and it's those two things, available and operational. There's a question that I've used occasionally in which somebody was driving a 1950-something car. Back in those days, cars didn't have seat belts. If the car is not equipped with a seat belt, then there's no comparative negligence in not using the seat belt, or if the seat belt doesn't work. But here we have an available and operational seat belt, and yes, it raises a presumption of comparative negligence, but it does not act as an absolute bar, which is key. After David carelessly ran a red light, well, how else are you going to run a red light? I don't know. But anyway, they're laying it on thick, so we know we're going to be talking about negligence. His car collided broadside with Peter's car. So then you know the impact forced Peter's head into the car's window, shattering the glass, cutting Peter's head, which caused profuse bleeding. It's gory and it's torts and it's negligence, but what are they trying to elicit there?
The Good Samaritan statute?
Well, that comes later, but you haven't gotten there yet. But just
standard of care. Wait, what are you asking?
Well, yeah, he's forced into the windshield.
Oh, his fault. If he had a seatbelt on, it wouldn't have been.
Well, that's part. But I'm actually looking for something different.
The nurse couldn't have possibly seen it.
Well, yeah, you're all kind of jumping ahead, and it's not unusual. There is something that you should be thinking about.
Rescues are foreseeable.
Not even there.
I'm intervening and superseding again.
He's driving a car. One of the reasons why I like to do this question from time to time. He's driving a car. Somebody gets injured. We're talking torts, but what should we do first? Well, it could be not in this case, but it could be. But what should you do first? If you're going to sue, what do you have to do first in Florida?
For medical.
No, not even getting to the medical yet.
Jurisdiction be challenged.
Anybody ever heard of the PIP statute? No fault insurance. First thing you have to do is go through the insurance, and they're establishing a permanent injury here, which is something.
Did y'all get this in Marbury? Because I didn't get this. No fault. I'm going to break this shit down.
A typical automobile accident question. First thing you got to deal with is insurance in Florida. if there's insurance, and we'll go through it in a moment, you got to go through the PIP statute first before you can bring a lawsuit. Why are we even in court? So once again, taking things in order. So we'll get to the details of that in a moment. Believe me, it's how I feel too. But see, I spend time thinking about which of these questions I'm going to use. And I use older questions, if you notice the dates, because the commercial courses don't usually use the older questions. I'm trying not to duplicate what they do. But I look for things like that you won't necessarily get anyplace else, but these things come up over and over and over again. And if you get an auto accident question, and you could, and I'll tell you why you could now, because there's been recent litigation, and a lot of people are talking about med-mal in particular, and we'll get there. I think a question like this is entirely possible. You're going to pick up a whole bunch of points by going through the modified no-fault insurance statute that most people will miss. And that's the name of the game. You get points that other people don't get. So we'll get to the details in a moment. So now we get to Natalie, a registered nurse and a bystander. So she's a registered nurse, and so that's going to speak to her what? Her duty, scope of her duty, right, because she's a professional, and she's a bystander. So now we get to the Good Samaritan statute, because she's a bystander. She notices the bleeding, rushes over to render medical aid. And our Good Samaritan statute in Florida for people on the roadside, useless. Because what standard of care does it require? Ordinary care. The Good Samaritan statute in Florida excuses someone only if he or she uses ordinary care. Well, that's the common law. In an emergency room for medical professionals, there's a different standard, which we'll get to. But for someone who renders aid on the roadside, our Good Samaritan statute is totally useless. Now, Natalie, and she's a nurse. She's panicked by all the blood. Come on, she's a nurse. But anyway. She failed to carefully check the wound first and drove a piece of glass deeper into the wound. So we know she has been negligent, right? Ambulance came. This is a typical torts question. So now the ambulance comes. At least the ambulance didn't get into an accident. You would have expected that, right? Yeah, I know. Yeah, you know how it goes.
At least he was alive at the end.
Yeah, true. Which is actually really important for recent Florida case law. The fact that he's alive makes a difference. We'll get there. Ambulance came, took Peter to the emergency room, and there is a separate part of the Good Samaritan statute that deals with emergency room care. And he's in stable condition. He's examined by Erin, who's the ER doc. Erin, fails to examine the head wound closely and stitch the wound close with the glass still inside. Well, that's dumb. But it's also negligent, and now, as I said, there's a different standard. We judge her by gross negligence because she's in the ER. But any way you cut it, that's gross negligence, I think. Glass eventually severed a nerve that left Peter blind in one eye. Relevant, guess what? Going back to the no-fault insurance statute. Assume you are a sole practitioner, and we're going to leave aside by the way, in this question, especially because of the clock, the professional responsibility aspects. Just a comment on the pro-rep ethics parts of these questions. They are almost always at the end of the question. But doesn't mean they're not important. They are very important. You are knocking on the door and asking to be let into our profession. And if the grader sees that you don't know the rules of our profession, that's bad, number one. Number two, again, not to panic, but it's actually happened. Most of the questions are going to be short. They'll be on one page. But a few years ago, and I believe it was a torts question, question filled up the page and seemed to come to a reasonable end in terms of torts. The other side had the professional responsibility question. And a number of people didn't turn the question over and missed the pro-rep part of the question, which was pretty easy. So, a word to the wise. You get 3 questions in your packet. Make sure you look front and back on all questions, even if it looks like it's done, even if it's short, make sure you check the back. So again, we're going to focus just on the torts now because of time. So here is the call of the question: likelihood of success as to each of the following individuals, David, Natalie, and Aaron. Now, and you notice that I have the hospital in parentheses. That's why I have the hospital in parentheses. In my answer, if this were my essay, I would not address the hospital. It's not in the call of the question. You're not going to get any points. I include it in parentheses because so many people ask about it. So, if, I'll mention it briefly in the name of time, but remember, you would not write about it. So, going in order, if they give you a call of the question, and we'll see this in a lot of our questions, that is more specific than just discuss, answer the points in the order that they are given, because that's the order that the grading outline will be in. And once again, you want to make it as easy for the grader as possible. You want the grader to have the grading outline here, your essay there, and just going, like this. Everything matches up perfectly. So we're going to start with David. Florida modified no fault auto insurance. And then prima facie case and defenses. You can't get into court unless you go through the insurance first. And just as an aside, in case you were wondering, and probably most of you are going to kind of go, huh, because you haven't had Florida Con Law yet. The original Florida no-fault insurance statute, which didn't have any avenue into court, gave rise to the Kluger Doctrine, Kluger versus White. Anybody know what the Kluger Doctrine is? Florida Con Law folks? Access to courts. And because there was no access to courts, the court struck down the original statute, which is why we have the modified statute. We'll talk about access to courts later. Judge Shepard will talk about access to courts in 2 weeks. So let's talk about that statute. Now, here's a place where you can have as close to a canned answer as I'm going to allow, if you will. They're never going to give you a lot of facts, so you can't do a lot with the statute. But you should be prepared to write a paragraph about no-fault insurance because they tested a lot. And there were some recent changes which were challenged, but which at this point in time are still on the books. So I have them underlined, the recent changes. We have that system, and the first thing you have to do is go to your insurance company, and you've got to do it within 14 days now. That's a new addition. I'm not going to read all of this in great detail. Again, you've got it down there. And it's for certain kinds of conditions and certain kinds of treatments, which is one of the problems if you look at, but notice, serious jeopardy to the patient's health, serious impairment of bodily functions. We're looking for something like glass driven into the eye. It's not a minor injury. Dysfunction of any bodily organ or part, well, now he loses sight in one eye. And notice that if the injury is not an emergency, you're now limited to just $2,500. It's nothing. I mean, that's not even an emergency room visit, to be honest. But the key is right here in the part that isn't underlined. Maximum from your insurance, maximum of $10,000 for up to 80% of medical expenses, 60% of lost income, and death benefits of $5,000 per person. You want to at least be able to recite that part. And that limit right there to $2,500 if it's not emergency. The statute, some of the other underlined parts, some of the stuff that's excluded, it's kind of, this is what caused litigation, acupuncture, massage, and certain industries were not happy about the new statute. I wouldn't worry too much about that part, but this right here that I don't have underlined, that's key. So for your hard costs, again, hard costs, medical, lost wages, death benefits. Those are your hard costs. Soft costs, pain and suffering, loss of consortium. That's a different issue. We'll get there in a second. So in this case, Peter has to go to his insurance company first for the first $10,000 up to, you know, those limits for his injury to his eye. Now, he's got the permanent injury, so he falls within the category. And the question is, can he now get pain and suffering? And the answer is yes. You can go outside the PIP statute, because the PIP statute doesn't award damages for pain and suffering. He can also sue for anything that exceeds that $10,000. So he can get hard costs exceeding $10,000 from David, and he can get soft costs from David if he has, as he does in this case, the permanent injury. So once again, get some nugget, some paragraph worth that you can write about there without going into great detail, because they do love to test the PIP statute. It shows up again and again, and a lot of people just breeze right past it, and you will get points that other people don't get, and that's how you pass the exam. So there are our two, the pain and suffering, and then again the excess costs. Okay, now let's get to the tort, the regular tort part of it. And of course, if we're talking about negligence, duty, breach, causation, damages, you know the drill on that. We have to establish the duty first, and obviously David ran the red light, so he had a duty not to run a red light, and he breached it. Now, what I didn't do here is you could. I'm not sure you have to. I didn't talk about negligence per se here, because they didn't specifically give the statute. But I can't say that it is wrong. Honestly, you certainly, if somebody goes through a red light, there must have been a statute or an ordinance. So negligence per se is fine. Understand this about negligence per se in Florida. As with negligence per se any place, it establishes just duty and breach. That's it. And it's in Florida, when it comes to violation of a traffic ordinance, it raises a rebuttable presumption of duty and breach. That's it. So it's not conclusive, just rebuttable. And there is case law in Florida speaking specifically to traffic ordinances.
If traffic, it just does what?
Just a rebuttable presumption of duty and breach, that's all. Okay. If you think back to your torts class, negligence per se means different things in different jurisdictions. And in some jurisdictions, it may create an irrebuttable presumption. But in Florida, at least in respect to traffic, because that much I have researched, it's a rebuttable presumption. But you're going to get to the same place. There's clearly a breach here. Now, causation. Make sure that you talk about cause and fact first, and then proximate cause. Both are easy here, but you still want to separate them out. And when we come to cause and fact, use that but-for test. Depending on who you had for torts and how it was presented, you may have spent more time talking about substantial factor. Don't use substantial factor except in a rare case. You use but-for if you have one cause, or if you have multiple causes, which is what you have in this case, none of which acting alone would have caused the entire harm, which is exactly what happened here. It's the combination of everybody that caused Peter to go blind. Use substantial factor only if you have multiple causes, any one of which would have caused the entire harm. And honestly, where you'll see that will be in the fire cases. Fire starts negligently over here. Fire starts negligently over there. They burn together, burn the house down in the middle. It's the exception, not the rule. I'm sorry? Substantial factor is used only if you have multiple causes, any one of which, acting alone, would have caused the entire harm. And again, that's your fire case. We have two negligently started fires on opposite sides of a house. They burned together and burned the house down. Either fire would have caused the house to burn down. But that's about the only place where you'll use substantial factor in the context of negligence. But-for is easy here, because clearly, if David hadn't run the red light, the whole chain would not have started. Legal cause, proximate cause. Use foreseeability. You know, you don't have to get too crazy and talk about the different tests. They're looking for foreseeability, and it's foreseeability of the harm that's key to proximate cause. And certainly, was it foreseeable in this case that Peter might be injured if David ran the red light? Sure. What else might you need to think about here, though? We have David running through the red light, and then intervening causes. Yeah. We've got Aaron, Natalie at the site, and then we've got Aaron in the ER room. They are intervening causes. They came after, but they're foreseeable. Remember, medical malpractice, unless it is intentional. The Angel of Mercy nurse who administers the lethal dose of morphine. Otherwise, medical malpractice is going to be foreseeable. So I would certainly mention that here. I might, I wouldn't spend a lot of time. In fact, where did I put it? I just briefly discuss it here without going into detail of the individuals. You can, particularly if you're handwriting, but even if you're typing, you can say as will be discussed later or as was discussed before. You can take shortcuts that way. And certainly the medical malpractice in this case would have been foreseeable, so it's a superseding but not, an intervening but not superseding cause. Last, of course, is damages. Now, you do want to say something more than he suffered damages, because in Florida, we recognize several different kinds of damages. We recognize economic damages, the hard costs, lost wages, medical bills, so forth, and non-economic pain and suffering, and both of those, of course, are important not only in respect to getting to the suit, getting past the PIP statute to the suit, but also in terms of the caps on med mal, which we'll get to in a moment. Now, I just throw this in. Honestly, unless you're a real glutton for punishment, you're probably not going to memorize this long list of collateral sources. Take a look at it, though. What I would do on an essay is just say, oh, no, by the way, under the collateral source rule, the recovery might be limited. You're going to get some points just by saying that much without knowing the detail. Another place where most people won't even say anything at all. So, you're just trying to pick up points as you can, and it is highly relevant because the collateral source rule in reality comes into play a lot more than you might think. But again, I wouldn't necessarily, and honestly, I'd have to stop and really think to recall all these categories myself. Just mention it in a generic way, and you've done your job. Now,
This would be the spot where I was saying about like punities. Would you not throw that in like
I didn't hear. I can't say it's wrong to maybe put a sentence in, but I would not spend it.
It would be like a right sentence, right?
Yeah.
You can't say
they
lie.
Yeah. Yeah.
Should not apply these no gross.
Right. It's as much as you can say here, and that's why I didn't include it. I will tell you that when they want to test punitive damages, they usually ask specifically about it.
Okay.
It's interesting. If you go back and look at the old questions, they usually specifically put it in the call to question. Now, however, comparative negligence, of course, important here. And is there anybody out there who didn't know that Florida is a pure comparative negligence state? Okay, if you didn't, now you do, right? That's the kind of Florida law you have to know, pure comparative negligence. So, of course, if our plaintiff is 99.5% negligent, the plaintiff can still recover for that 0.5%. And as I mentioned before, clearly they want you to discuss the seatbelt statute, the keywords available and operational. It appears there was a seatbelt in this case because they say that Peter wasn't wearing it. And there's no indication that it wasn't operational. They didn't say it was broken or anything like that. So was Peter comparatively negligent? Yes, he was. And what will we do then, of course? We will apportion the loss. Now, vocabulary becomes very important here. Comparative negligence is negligence, plaintiff versus defendant. When we're talking about, as we will later, defendant versus defendant, it's relative fault. Comparative negligence, plaintiff versus defendant. Defendant versus defendant, relative fault. And you know, of course, since Florida has abolished joint and several liability, that now we apportion damages to any individual defendant based on relative fault. And again, vocabulary matters a lot in this particular area. All right, and no negligence per se for the seatbelt statute in Florida. It is just evidence of comparative fault. It's also not considered in mitigation. Vocabulary, what is mitigation of damages? Mitigation of damages in tort is what you should have done before the incident occurred that would prevent or at least lessen your loss. Putting on a seatbelt before you start to drive, mitigation of damages. Avoidance of the loss, it's what you do afterwards. So if you know, for example, Peter here, if he didn't go to the hospital, went home and let himself bleed out or something. So mitigation, again, is what you do before. The avoidance is what happens afterwards. Okay, so we went through that part. Now, Natalie and Aaron, notice I took them together. This is a long question, and you can do grouping if it makes sense. There is a little bit of difference in terms of the facts, and I split it off in certain places, but in the end, we're going to get down to medical malpractice, and the issues are going to be the same for both of them. And the hospital, again, I put it in parentheses only because so many people ask about it. Now, Good Samaritan, as I mentioned before, if you're on site, if you're at the site of the accident, then you are protected, but only if you use ordinary care, which makes that statute, again, useless. What is ordinary care, of course, depends on your reasonable defendant, and because she's a professional, then we judge her by the professional standard. We're going to use a community standard unless, and they didn't give you any facts here, unless there's a national accrediting agency or a national license. Minor thing. In this case, they don't really give you the facts to decide it. Doesn't matter whether you're using a national or a local community standard. A registered nurse shouldn't panic at the sight of blood. Okay, so it's negligence, whatever. We know what the duty is, and we know she breached it because she failed to meet that standard. Now, Erin, the duty is a little different because she was in the ER, and notice, reckless conduct this time. So I guess because of the craziness of an ER, I don't know, that the statute does distinguish. But she acts recklessly if she knew or should have known of an unreasonable risk of injury, and the risk is substantially greater than the risk necessary to make the conduct negligent. So we're looking for something that she really should have known about. And clearly, an ER doc should check a wound before suturing it up. So I think it's hard to say it wasn't reckless on her part.
Are you calling it medical negligence just as a...
It's what the statute calls it.
Okay, that's fine.
That's what the statute calls it. Using the vocabulary.
No, that's what I was asking. So
Yep.
For Florida, I should be calling it that, not malpractice.
Yeah, and I have, yeah, that's why I say throughout medical negligence. I think at the beginning I said malpractice, but the statute specifically says medical negligence. The hospital, I'm going to skip that. You can look at it. Again, that's there just because so many people ask about it. And if you get a question, though, with the hospital mixed in and they ask you about the hospital, remember that the hospital itself could be negligent in hiring, negligent in supervision, and it could also have vicarious liability. Those are two separate things. And they do like to test those two separate things together. the negligence in hiring or supervising and vicarious liability, employer-employee. So to istinguish. Question?
Aren't in Florida doctors are independent contractors?
They may be.
So you bring it up and
Yeah,
say
right.
they might have another defense.
Right. Yeah, exactly, yeah. Now, causation, I don't have to go through that again. Same thing. Clearly, causation is present, and there is, while in respect to Natalie, there's an intervening cause, it's not superseding because it's medical malpractice or medical negligence in the Florida terms. And damages, now, I'm going to get there, but okay, we'll go past vicarious liability. Okay. Now, when it comes to medical negligence, the system, is there anybody here who's clerked in a firm that does med mal? No, it's a lot of times. If they give you a question like this, somebody's going to get really lucky because somebody's going to know all the details. The rest of you guys, you're not. So it's another place where knowing, being able to write a little bit of a paragraph, certain things, can get you a long way. You need a pre-suit investigation, which results in a written opinion. If you kind of hit the highlights of what I have in this part, it'll go a long way toward getting you points should you get medical negligence. You have to serve notice of the suit. First you have to do the investigation, then you serve notice that you're going to sue. And then the insurer gets time to respond. I'm going to pay, I'm not going to pay. And during that time period, of course, the statute of limitations is told, because you have to give the insurance company time to make a decision. Now, here comes the hard part. I had actually, I hadn't used this question in a while. I had it on my radar for last summer. And then Florida Supreme Court decided a really important case, and the holding wasn't clear, and so I pulled the question. But now enough time has passed, and we have enough sense of what we think the opinion means. They like to test timely stuff. So you could see med mal with this little twist involved. This particular case, the McCall case, did strike down the med mal caps in a limited situation, wrongful death only. The opinion was very carefully crafted by Justice Lewis and written in a way that limited the holding, to non-economic damages in in wrongful death cases only. Notice, and that's why I said at the beginnings, I think Chris mentioned it, Peter's alive. It actually now makes a big difference, because the caps that I'm going to talk about in a moment are still applicable to the best of our knowledge outside of wrongful death. Look how carefully you need to read the question and how carefully you need to parse the law. You want to know this distinction. They could easily test it. Even though the case was decided last March, and that's not a whole year from the time you're taking the exam, the questions are in the pipeline for about 2 years before they give them. This case has been in the pipeline for a number of years. And so it's been on the radar. And pay attention to what's going on in the news. Stuff that's in the news, on the radar, it's the stuff that shows up in the questions. Now, here comes the hard part. In this case, because we're not dealing with wrongful death, the caps apply. I am not going to read you all the caps or all the detail, and I leave it to you. Once upon a time, when we had joint and several liability, Florida just went around and around in circles, and we had some really complicated joint and several liability rules. And I would say the same thing then about joint and several liability as I now say about these medical malpractice caps. There are going to be some people taking the exam who know all the details, and they will get the most points. For the rest of you, take a look at some of the stuff. Look at all the numbers. I'm not going to read them all. Look at all the numbers. You decide how much of this detail you think you can absorb. At least be able to say that there are caps and that the caps apply outside the context of wrongful death for non-economic damages, again, the soft costs. And also, I mean, there are caps for economic as well, but the real key is the limits on non-economic here. And that we distinguish between practitioner defendants and non-practitioner defendants. And if you can say that much, you're going to get some points. How much of the rest of this? I mean, it goes on page after page. Yeah. I can't even, honestly, I mean, I can't even recite all of it. There's just a lot of detail there. There are times, and here's one, where you have to spot them a little bit. If you know it, write it. But if you don't think you can learn all this, and honestly, would I? I probably wouldn't. I'd get the general outline, hit the high points that I've been talking to you about, get at least as many points as I could, and move on. So, but read through it and read through the materials so at least some of it sticks in your brain, because I'm telling you, this is the kind of question you could get this time. Now, finally, the joint tortfeasors, because they love to test joint tortfeasors. Again, this part of the equation has now become very simple. It used to be very complicated. Liability based on, again, that phrase, relative fault, defendant versus defendant, relative fault, and indemnification. We're not talking about what other word there? Contribution, right? Because contribution goes hand in hand with joint and several liability, which was abolished in 2006 in Florida. So, vocabulary, vocabulary, vocabulary. Indemnification is a possibility in this case. Contribution is not. So, in Florida now, liability determined solely on the basis of relative fault, even if that person isn't in court. If you can get them on the jury ballot, that's all you need. The details of that part and favor and all that, you don't need. Just know that it's going to be apportioned relative fault. Indemnification means that a person has paid solely on the basis of his relationship to somebody else. If the hospital were involved here, honestly, the three defendants here are all negligent, and so indemnification for David, Natalie, and Aaron isn't going to be a possibility. If the hospital is sued simply through vicarious liability, simply by its relationship to Aaron, for example, the ER doc, then indemnification is appropriate. With indemnification, the defendant who is passively liable, is the term that's sometimes used, may pass the entire loss on to the party who was actively negligent. Okay, questions on this question? Chris?
Just on this last thing about joint and several, the
Yes.
basic concept is the same. They change the words around, but essentially, like, we don't have joint and several, but we have more like pure several liability, right?
Correct.
So I'm only liable for my percentage?
Right,
That's it.
right. And let me emphasize, here's a big difference between Florida law and MBE law, because on the MBE, they're still going to test you on traditional joint and several liability. Joint and several liability, each defendant can be sued for how much? The entire amount, regardless of that defendant's percentage of fault. Now, if a defendant under the MBE rule and joint and several liability rule is sued for the entire amount, then he or she can then turn around and seek contribution from the other guilty party up to, under the modern rule, the portion of fault. Florida has abolished joint and several liability. Liability is several only, which means you are liable only for your relative fault, and there's some recent case law that looks at this point again. Even if the plaintiff is not made whole, for whatever reason, you've got a defendant you can't serve, you've got a defendant who's got other reasons, defenses. If the plaintiff is not made whole, nevertheless, each defendant pays only up to his or her or its relative fault. Okay, that's it. We actually got out of here before 6, and we'll see you for Professor Martin next Friday at 3 o'clock.